Hey guys, it's Pastor Ken here. Welcome to our online service for Every Nation Melbourne. And we are continuing our series on prophetic. And we as a people at Every Nation Melbourne, and we as Christians, we as a people who love and follow Jesus, who we consider to be the true King, fully human, fully God, we are a people who are a prophetic people. We have a prophetic identity. And that's why we're doing this kind of series that's called Prophetic. We want to explore what does it mean for us to have a prophetic identity. And we are part of the Pentecostal / charismatic stream of Christianity. And Pentecostalism can tend to reduce being prophetic to merely hearing God's voice, if there is such a thing. Of course, it's an incredible privilege to hear God's voice, but we can reduce our prophetic identity down to just hearing God's voice. That's great, hearing God's voice. Having the gift of prophecy, that's incredibly powerful to build each other up. However, there is so much more to our prophetic identity than the gift of prophecy and hearing God's voice. There is so much more. There's the gift of prophecy, but then there's also a prophetic identity, and that's what we're exploring. Our prophetic identity, this is why it's important. Our prophetic identity is given to us as a response to human brokenness and human exploitation that's all around us. All around us in the city of Melbourne, there is human exploitation and human brokenness, and God is wanting his people to rise up, lay hold of their prophetic identity, and to see to it that out of an encounter with God, human exploitation ceases, and that people are set free to worship him. And so we've been exploring this in the past 2 weeks, this idea of a prophetic identity. And last week we looked at the idea of a prophetic impulse that all humans have. All humans have a prophetic impulse. Now, often as human beings, we're very good at squashing that impulse, that prophetic impulse, but every now and then it erupts out, and there's a desire, there's a cry for justice. There's a cry to say, hey, that's wrong, and we want to do something about it. And we actually saw last week what happens when we follow our prophetic impulse apart from God. We looked at the character of Moses. Moses is kind of really the archetypal prophet in the Hebrew Bible. That is, all of the other prophets that come after Moses, they model themselves after Moses. He's the original in many ways. So Moses, the archetypal prophet, think about this because this is crazy. If you want to go into more depth, have a look at last week's message. But Moses saw injustice taking place. A slave, a Hebrew slave, was being treated harshly, and he said, that's wrong. People shouldn't be treated like that. And what he did is that in his own strength, seeing that injustice, he did something about it. He murdered the person who was doing the injustice, and which obviously is wrong. And that's what can happen when, even though we all have a prophetic impulse as humans and we try to distract ourselves with all the things that the world wants to distract us with, every now and then we see something that's wrong and we go, you know what, I want to do something about it. And if we do something about that injustice or that exploitation in our own strength, often we fight evil with evil. That's what Moses did. Moses, he is the archetypal prophet of the Old Testament, of the Hebrew Bible, and he did it wrong to begin with. He murdered someone. And actually, that's what still happens in our day and age. When human beings try to fix what's broken, or human beings try to confront exploitation, whether it's humans exploiting humans, or humans exploiting the environment, or whatever is going on, things that shouldn't be the way they are, things that God never intended to be that way. When we try to fight it or fix it in our own strength, we're actually fighting evil with evil. What's actually changed? But if we encounter God, so Moses, he tried to fix the exploitation of the enslavement of God's people, the Israelites, the Hebrews. He tried to fix it in his own strength, and it all went wrong. He murdered someone, and it all went wrong. But later on, 40 years later, after giving up on the dream of trying to set God's people free, Moses had an encounter with God. And if we can be like Moses, and if we can join our prophetic impulse, the desire to say, hey, that's wrong. Hey, it shouldn't be that way. There must be a better way. If we can join our prophetic impulse to God's prophetic character, then what happens is a prophetic impulse and God's prophetic character, we join that together and we have our prophetic identity. We realize our prophetic identity. So this is what happened. Moses, he encountered God at the burning bush. He tried to set God's people free in his own strength. 40 years later, after failing and forgetting about God's people because of how drastic that failure was, Moses, he encounters God at the burning bush, and at the burning bush he hears God's heart, and he hears God's name. God's heart and God's name is revealed to Moses in an encounter of intimacy. And only after hearing God's heart, and this is what he learned about God's heart. God cares about the people who are being oppressed. He learns God's heart. God says, I'm hearing about the suffering of my people. I hear their cries. I care for them. I see how they're being mistreated. I don't like it. So Moses, he hears God's heart, and then he hears God's name. Moses says, when I go to the people of Israel, whom shall I say sent me? And God replies, tell them I am. Tell them Yahweh sent you. So Moses, he hears God's heart and he hears God's name. Only after this does Moses move into his prophetic identity. Having an encounter where he knows God's name, having an encounter where he knows God's heart, he then goes to God's people who are in bondage, and he demands that they be set free so that they can worship him. Moses tried it in his own strength and failed. But after that encounter, learning the heart of God and the name of God, he sees God's people set free so that they can worship him. And that's kind of why we're doing this series. Because if you think about it, and maybe I'm sure you don't even need to think about it that hard, but if you think about it just a little bit, isn't there a people in Melbourne? Isn't a whole city filled with people? Maybe they're living right next to you, maybe they're sitting next to you in the workplace, or whatever, on the Zoom meeting, there that square on the screen next to you in that Zoom meeting. But isn't there a people that are in bondage? Isn't there a people that are being exploited? Isn't there a people that in some way, maybe they seem so successful in a whole bunch of other ways that the world will measure success, but in some way they're in bondage, in some way they're being exploited. And doesn't God want to set them free? Doesn't God want to set them free so that they can worship him? That's why we're doing this series. It's time for us, Every Nation Melbourne, to rise up and lay hold of our prophetic identity that comes out of an encounter with God. I love it. I love that after an intentional encounter with God, that we can discover his heart, and that we can see people set free from exploitation, from bondage, from shame. And I want to explore that just a little bit more. And so let's have a look at Exodus chapter 19. I'm going to read verses 16 to 20, and let's get some lessons out of this that apply to us being a prophetic people here in Melbourne. So verse 16 from Exodus chapter 19. On the morning of the third day there was thunder and lightning with a thick cloud over the mountain, that's Mount Sinai, and a very loud trumpet blast. Everyone in the camp trembled. Then Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke because the Lord descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. As the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered him. The Lord descended to the top of Mount Sinai and called Moses to the top of the mountain. So Moses went up. So here we have a passage. Moses has gone to Pharaoh and said, let God's people go so that they can worship him. What you're doing is wrong. They shouldn't be exploited the way you're exploiting them. They shouldn't be in bondage. And so Moses leads the people out after the plagues that come and hit Egypt, and after they cross over the Red Sea, and now they are they're in the wilderness on the way to the promised land. And Moses has led the people to the foot of Mount Sinai, and it's at Mount Sinai that God wants to set out his covenant with his people that he's just delivered from bondage. So, and God's presence descends upon Mount Sinai, and God calls Moses to ascend. So there's this meeting of God coming down and Moses going up. God comes down and Moses goes up. So Moses encountered God's heart and name at the burning bush, and now he's encountering God's heart more deeply. So that's what we're looking at today. We're exploring God's heart. And you might think this is a bit strange, but of this example that I'm using, but this is literally God's heart being shown to the people of Israel. This is God's heart being shown to Moses. Moses climbs up a mountain to meet with God, and he hears God's heart. And what he receives in hearing God's heart is the 10 Commandments, and more of God's covenant, of God's law, but he receives the 10 Commandments. So God gives Moses the 10 Commandments, not because he's all about rules, but because he wants to stop humans being exploited. Now, sometimes we think of God being about morality and laws and rules and all that kind of stuff, and we start to live like, I've got to tick the box, I've got to make sure that I'm not making God angry, that I'm not doing this and I'm not doing that, and I should be doing this, I shouldn't be doing that. And it's like we start to lose the point. We start to lose the heart behind everything. So behind the 10 Commandments is God's heart, and God's heart is that human beings are not exploited. He wants to stop human beings being exploited by unclean spirits and by each other. The 10 Commandments flow from God's prophetic identity. The 10 Commandments are given. God shows Moses. Moses has an encounter with God's heart through this time at Mount Sinai where the 10 Commandments are delivered, so that people can be set free. The 10 Commandments are all about our freedom. The 10 Commandments and God's law are all about us having the ability to worship God. God's heart. This is what is seen in the 10 Commandments. God's heart is seen in the 10 Commandments. And so you can read on. This passage from Exodus chapter 19, it leads directly into Exodus chapter 20, where the 10 Commandments are given. God's heart is seen in the 10 Commandments. God's heart is, I want people to be set free. I want people to have these principles so that they can live free. If you think about it, this is what's happened. God has set his people free from Egypt, and now he's giving them these principles at Mount Sinai so that they can continue to live free, and that they can bring freedom, so that they can flourish and that they can have freedom from exploitation. You know, that's why God gives his principles. That's why God gives the 10 Commandments. That's why God gives his laws. Not to restrict our freedom, but so that we can be free, so that we can flourish. And freedom really is freedom from being exploited. Now, I haven't got time to go through all the 10 Commandments. Please read it in your own time. But when you do, think about, how does this set me free from exploitation? How does this set me free to flourish? Now, I haven't got time to go through all the 10 Commandments, but let me give you 3 examples out of the 10. Literally in the 10 Commandments, God has the welfare of workers in his mind. He wants to stop human beings being exploited. Imagine if your boss could work you 7 days a week. Would he? And that's what they used to do in the ancient world, where you had to work all the time. But God is saying, no, I don't want you to work 7 days a week. I want you to have a day off. So we think of Karl Marx and communism as like, they're the ones who really cared about the workers. Well, before communism, before Karl Marx, before all of our modern labor laws, there was God's law, God's principle for human flourishing, God's principle to stop human exploitation. You need to take a day off. It's not a law that we have to keep to make God happy. It's a principle that God reveals to us so that we can be free, so that employers cannot exploit employees, so that owners of land cannot exploit those who work the land. It was for freedom. A day off a week, which was radical. 3,300 years before Karl Marx, God was thinking about the welfare of his people, the welfare of his workers. That's just one. That's just the law about the Sabbath. God's heart means he wants us to rest. That's God's heart, revealed in the 10 Commandments, revealed in his covenant with the people of Israel. He wants us to rest. He wants us to not be exploited by the rat race, by hyper-consumerism, by rampaging crony capitalism. Our culture says you've got to have this amount of money, you've got to drive this kind of car, you've got to live in this suburb, you've got to work as hard as you can to get there. God says, no, I will give you what you need, I will provide for you, and I want you to take a day off. I want you to rest because I love you. And I want you to stop being exploited. That's one of them. God's heart means he doesn't want humans to be exploited by unclean spirits. God doesn't want us to be exploited by the demonic. God doesn't want us to be enslaved by evil spirits. Therefore, don't worship idols. This is not about God being petty and jealous and like he doesn't want you to give your attention to other gods. No, God knows what the other gods are. They're actually unclean spirits and they're demonic, and he wants you to be set free from the fear that they will bring to you. Have you ever lived in an animistic culture? Have you ever lived where people are afraid of unclean spirits? I know people whose lives are all about appeasing the spirits. They have to worship their idols. And God is saying, don't worship them, worship me. I will protect you from the fear and the bondage that comes from worshiping idols. God's heart means he doesn't want us to be exploited by the demonic. God's heart means that he doesn't want parents to be exploited. The commandment that says, honor your parents, honor your mother and father. That's not just about, writing them a birthday card. That's not just about, doing what they say as kids. That's for when people are grown up and not just forgetting about their parents and saying, oh, you've given so much to me and now I'm just going to ignore you. And literally the idea of honoring your parents is pay for them. Pay for your parents. Ensure their welfare. The word honor is connected to payment. Pay for your parents in their old age. Look after them like they look after you. Don't just take all the benefits and neglect your responsibilities. Be responsible for your parents as they get older, just as you were taken care of by them when you were younger. So that's 3 of the 10 commandments, and just explaining how they actually reflect God's heart, that we are not exploited and that we don't exploit others. Because God's heart isn't just about rules. God's heart is about our freedom from exploitation. So, our prophetic identity, flowing from an encounter with God's heart, means we have another way. We don't have to fight the stuff that we see in the world around us, the exploitation that we see all around us, with nothing. We can actually prophetically oppose exploitation with God's way, with God's heart. And so when we see things in the world all around us, and when we see things in our workplace, or we see things on our campus, or in our neighborhood, or in our apartment building that are not right, we don't have to say, you know what, that's wrong, but I've got no idea what to do with it. Oh, there should be another way. Well, what way should it be? Well, I don't know. No, when we see something's wrong, we can say that's wrong, and there is a better way, and it's God's heart. Because God's heart is that we do not exploit each other. God's heart is that we are able to live in freedom and flourishing. We don't have to fight something with nothing. We actually have answers to provide. Now, I don't know what all the answers are, but I believe that we can be a people. In Every Nation Melbourne, I believe that we can be a people that encounter God, just like Moses encountered God at Mt Sinai. Moses, he went up Mt Sinai. God came down from heaven and met with Moses at the top of Mt Sinai. So God comes down, Moses goes up. Moses has an encounter with God, and he hears God's heart, and it's shown to him in the 10 Commandments. And God's heart is shown. Don't exploit each other. Don't be exploited by evil spirits. Don't exploit your parents. Don't exploit your workers. Rest. Take time off. My heart is for you to flourish. So Moses has that encounter with God, and I believe that we can have that encounter with God. I want us to be a prophetic people, a people with a prophetic identity that meet with God, that hear his heart, and then speak his heart and demonstrate his answers to all that's going on around us. Communicate his ways to a world that's breaking itself apart through exploitation of each other, through exploitation of the environment. I believe that God wants to meet with you, that God wants to speak to you. He wants to speak to you of the solutions that your world needs. What's your world? Well, it's your family, it's your workplace, it's your neighbors. God is calling you to meet with him, just like he was calling Moses to meet with him. And just like he showed Moses his heart to see people set free from exploitation so that they can worship him, he wants to show you his heart so that those people in your world who are being held up in bondage can be set free. That's what it means to have a prophetic identity. To speak God's heart after an encounter with Him, so that people who are in bondage can be set free to worship Him. So just as we wrap up here, I said that Moses is the archetypal prophet of the Hebrew Bible. That all the other prophets that come after him, they go out of their way to be like Moses. So hey, I'm like Moses. That's why you can trust me as a prophet. But actually, I need to rephrase that and say, Moses, he's not just the archetypal prophet. He's probably more accurate to say he's the archetypal human prophet of the Hebrew Bible, because God is actually the archetypal prophet. Moses follows God. God is the original prophet. God defines prophetic identity. God defines prophetic identity and the desire to confront what is wrong and to expose exploitation. He defines that. That's what it means to be prophetic, a desire to confront what is wrong and exploit and to expose exploitation. God is the one who perfectly speaks truth to power. That's what prophets do. That's what people with a prophetic identity do. They speak truth to power. And God's commandments, they're not just about laws. Sometimes we fall into that trap that it's just about laws. We've got to do this, we've got to do that. No, God's commandments are really about His heart. They're not about keeping rules. God's commandments are about His heart. And you might think, Ken, you keep saying that. How could you possibly know that? Well, this is how I know it. Because when I broke the rules and when you broke the rules, when we as human beings rebelled against God and we broke the rules, when we broke His commandments, God the Son became human. And that person, Jesus Christ, fully God, fully human, He didn't come to shame us. He didn't come to punish us. He didn't come to say, you look at how much of a failure you guys are. No. Jesus came, fully God, fully human. When we broke the rules, Jesus came to make us whole. That's God's heart. Jesus came to set us free from bondage. That's God's heart. Jesus came to set us free from exploitation. The exploitation that we suffer under and the exploitation that we do and we commit against other people and the world around us. Jesus came to set us free. Jesus came to pay a price. That's how I know. That's how I know that the rules, God's 10 Commandments, aren't just about the rules. They're actually about His heart. Think about it this way. God set the people of Israel free from slavery first in the Exodus. And then He gave them His principles to live a life of freedom from exploitation and to live a life of freedom from exploiting one another. And then that picture of the people of Israel out of Exodus and then receiving the covenant of God's heart, the 10 Commandments, is fully realized in Jesus, who comes to me, the one who's broken all of His rules. It says, Ken, I'm not here to shame you. I'm not here to judge you. I'm not here to punish you. I'm here to make you whole. I'm here to set you free from exploitation. I'm here to pay a price for you. You know what? I think it'd be appropriate for us to celebrate that and give thanks for who Jesus is. So I want to invite you just now to prepare your elements, the sacraments for communion. See you soon.